my name is Harry Saantopoulos. I have developed a theory explaining how the universe works, and therefore gravity, using a physical mechanism that lies at a fundamental level. Now, there have been attempts in the past to explain the universe or gravity using a physical reality like an ether theory or the Lesage theory of gravitation. But these theories have their limitations. However, my theory overcomes these limitations and provides a mechanism that tells us how everything from how particles are made to how gravity works. So in this video, I will be explaining the mechanism for gravity, comparing my theory to the Lesage model, and explaining how my theory overcomes problems like drag and gravity shielding. But first, to properly understand how gravity works, we need to understand what the universe is and how it works. So our universe is a physical field existing in pre-existing space. So it has a boundary and it's an open field. Now, our universe is constructed from just two objects. The first is physical lines that have mass. These lines are millions of light years in length, and they would range from between 10 to 100 megaparsecs. However, they have a diameter or a width that is less than the radius of an electron. So why these figures? Well, the length of the lines are based on the size of cosmic voids, because the universe is not just one field, but a conglomerate of smaller fields. And the diameter must be less than the radius of the electron, because these lines are part of what particles like an electron are made of. Now, these lines are not rigid, so they are flexible. However, they are solid and they have mass. So the next object that makes up the universe is a particle I have called the Quanta particle, and it's the most numerous object in the universe. So this particle also has mass, and its diameter is the same as the diameter of a line. Its energy is kinetic, and its collisions are fully elastic. Now, the combination of the quanta particles and the lines form a three-dimensional field structure. So we have lines orientated in three spatial dimensions. Parallel lines are separated by lines orientated in a different direction. However, the lines are not in contact with each other. What keeps them separated is the quanta particle bouncing between the lines. So because the lines are not in contact with each other, the quanta particle can move around the lines freely. This allows the energy in the field to be homogeneous. So the field is a flat Euclidean space. So let's look at some of the fundamental principles of this theory. Now, quanta particles bouncing between field lines will impart their kinetic energy to the lines. So the amount of energy depends on the distance between the lines. So the closer the lines are, the greater the energy is. And this is because it takes less time for the quanta particles to travel between the lines. So therefore, the further apart the lines are, the weaker the energy is. So force is inverse to distance. So the quanta particles act as a repulsive force, pushing the field lines apart. However, when we add more lines, a counterforce is created. The repulsive force at column B is countered by the repulsive force in column A and column C. So this would exist throughout the whole field, creating a neutral energy but a potential energy. Now, it's important for us to understand how particles like electrons are made in order to understand how gravity works, because the process in which these particles are made changes the field in a localized area. And essentially, it's the different geometry of that localized area that is gravity. So that process is when the field is universally pushed together in a localized area towards a central point. So a number of quantum particles are pushed together to form a central mass, and the field lines are pushed onto that mass. So now the field lines encapsulate the mass of quantum particles, and now we have an object that has a much bigger diameter than a single quantum particle. So the field lines in this distorted area are no longer at 90 degrees to each other, but are pointed inwards towards the central mass of quantum particles. Now, the lines closest to the mass are the most distorted, and as you move away from the center, the lines become less distorted, and this becomes the field of the particle. Now, the radius of the particle creates a second distortion by projecting into the first distortion, and this increases energy around the particle. And that increase in energy will push the lines back to an undistorted state. However, what prevents this from happening and holds the particle together is a funneling effect of the quantum particles onto the radius by the distorted field lines. So the field lines distorted like this act as a funnel. Therefore, a quantum particle entering this funnel would be deflected off the lines and directed to the center, where it would collide with the radius. And the energy colliding with the radius is equal to the energy pushing the radius out. So it's this that holds the particle together. Now, a net directional force is created because more energy is directed towards a smaller area. As a quantum particle moves out of the funnel, it's moving into a larger area. This also creates a force inverse to distance. So let's get to exactly how gravity works. And I'm not going to go into all the details about gravity, just the basic mechanism. If you are interested in more details on how my theory explains gravity, I have put out a previous video, the Quanta field hypothesis of the universe. Now, gravity is a local inward distortion of the field lines, just like the inward distortion around a negative particle. Therefore, it's a negative field. So the field lines are pulled towards a central point. Now, as you move away from that central point, the lines become less distorted. So the force weakens over distance. Therefore, an object entering a gravity field will be affected by the field instantaneously, which allows action at a distance. So we don't need any kind of transmission between objects for gravity to have an instant effect. Now, an object entering a gravity field will in part conform to the field and will also distort the field. The object pushes the field lines above it closer together. This increases more energy above the object, and that energy or force pushes the object down. Now, below the object, the field lines are stretched towards a central mass. So the bottom part of the object is also stretched as it conforms to the shape of the field. So below the object, the field is negative, and above the object itself is creating a positive force. So at the same time it's being pushed and pulled towards the ground. Now, as an object is falling in a gravity field, the energy above the object increases, and the energy below the object becomes more negative. However, the ratio of energy above and below the object remains constant, and it's this that gives us an equivalence to an inertial reference frame. So gravity is a balanced force. So the force on one side of the planet is equal to the force directly opposite on the other side of the planet. So let's set up the following scenario. Let's assume there are two planets moving very slowly towards each other. Both planets have the same mass and density. This scenario best compares with the Lesage model. As they approach each other, each planet is pulling the field lines off the other one, because between the planets an area of opposing fields is created. In this area, the distance between the lines is greater, so the energy between them is weaker. This weakens the funneling effect for each planet, but only on the side that is between the planets. So on the opposite side, the force stays the same. So whereas before the force on both sides is balanced, there is now an unbalanced force pushing the two planets together. Okay, so if we go back to the Lesage model, both planets are shielding each other. So therefore, there should be a reduction in particles between the planets. However, particle D, which will not normally hit planet A, is reflected by the presence of planet B, and therefore compensates for any shielding effect. Now with my model, particle D would also be reflected. However, this does not compensate for any shielding effect, because in my model it's the opposing fields that create an area between the planets where the lines are wider apart, and therefore a reduction in energy. Now, in my theory, force is proportional to how distorted the field is. So the larger the mass and the more dense it is, the greater the field lines are distorted, and therefore you have a force proportional to mass. Now, to fully understand how an object moves through the field requires a lengthy explanation, but here I'll just give you the basics. If you would like more detail, then go to my previous video, the Quanta field hypothesis of the universe. Now, one of the major problems of any Lesage type theory, even with my theory, is the problem of creating resistance as an object moves through the medium. So how does my theory overcome this? Well, first, just to recap, a particle like an electron is a mass of quanta particles encapsulated by the field lines. So even though this mass is surrounded by field lines, it is still subjacent to the field. So this mass is in between field lines. Now, the field itself is at absolute rest, so the lines can only move along with the mass for a short distance. So as an object begins to move, field lines that were attached to it are constantly being replaced by oncoming field lines. So lines are attracted to the object and disengage from the object as it moves through the field. Now, the next thing we need to understand is that particles are not rigid. So particles like electrons are a collection of smaller quanta particles held together by field lines. So there's no force between individual quanta particles. This gives an object a high degree of plasticity. So any movement in any direction will change the shape of an object. Now let's imagine an object is under acceleration. So more quantum particles will begin to hit the object from the direction it's moving in. And this is the feeling of acceleration. Now the object will be pushing the field lines in front of it closer together. And that creates more energy between these lines and creates a leading force. And that force or energy is equal to the mass of the object times its velocity squared. Now the force of acceleration begins to change the shape of the object. It contracts the front of the object, and this is why we have length contraction. It also begins to elongate the object. Now this elongation projects into the field much more than the object's velocity does. So behind the object, the field lines have been pushed much closer together than the field lines in front of the object. And this creates more force or energy behind the object. So it's this back force that overcomes the resistance from the front. So we have a conservation of momentum. So resistance moving through a physical field is unavoidable, but because of a physical length contraction and the plasticity of particles, resistance is overcome. Now that we understand the plasticity of objects, we can now understand how an object stays in orbit. So gravity is a distortion of the field, and that distortion weakens as you move away from any large mass. So an object entering a gravitational field will be subject to an immediate effect. So we do not need to worry about a speed for gravity or some particle travelling between objects for gravity to work. So there is no time delay. Now, an object in orbit will have a number of different forces applied to it, and these forces will change the shape of the object. So the object is elongated due to its velocity, and that gives it its push force from direction A. Now, because of the object's elongated shape, the field lines under it are stretched closer together. This increases the force from direction D. Now, there is the force of gravity pushing it down from direction E, but this is countered by the force from the front of the object. So the bottom part of the object is closer to the mass of the planet, and the force at C is greater than at B, and it's this slight difference in the force that causes the object to constantly change direction and stay in orbit. Gravity shielding is an inevitable consequence of the Lesage model and my theory. Two planets within each other's gravitational field will reduce gravity on the side that is between the planets. However, they will also begin to accelerate towards each other, and it's this acceleration that replaces the reduction in gravity. As they begin to accelerate towards each other, they begin to push through the field. By doing so, they are pushing the lines in front of them closer together. This increases the energy between the lines and creates a force. It's this force that replaces the reduction in gravity. This also creates a resistance, but this resistance does not stop the two planets from moving towards each other, because the increasing resistance is equal to the decreasing rate of gravity. So resistance caused by accelerating through the field is equivalent to the force of gravity. Straight away, the problem with the Lesage theory is that there is no net directional force between two objects, because the shadowing of fine particles between objects is compensated by reflected fine particles that would not normally hit these two objects. In an attempt to overcome this, inelastic collisions are introduced, which just leads to more problems. With my theory, there is no need to introduce inelastic collisions. All collisions are fully elastic, eliminating the heat problem. And directional force is created by the funnel effect. Reflected quantum particles do not compensate between objects because of the negative field created between them. In my theory, gravity is proportional to mass, because the greater the mass and density, the greater the field lines are distorted, therefore the greater the funneling effect. We see in my theory that resistance created by acceleration through the field is equivalent to the force of gravity, so this compensates for gravity shielding. We also see in my theory that orbital aberration does not exist, because at any distance from the center of mass, the field is distorted at different values. So there is an instantaneous effect on an orbital body.